He had made a list once. He was 23 years old and he had written down in careful handwriting every major thing he believed would make his life feel complete. A specific salary number, a city to live in, a certain kind of apartment, high floor, good light, the kind of kitchen that made cooking feel like something worth doing. A partner who matched a particular set of qualities he had articulated with the confidence of someone who had never yet had to compromise. A title at work, recognition from people whose recognition he had decided would matter. He wasn't unusual. Most people have made this list, or some version of it, if not on paper, then in the part of the mind where the image of the good life lives, polished and waiting. By 31, he had almost everything on it: the salary, the city, the apartment with its high floor and good light, the partner, the title, the recognition, which had arrived in the form of a promotion that he remembered feeling genuinely moved by for approximately 4 days before it dissolved into the texture of normal life. He sat in his kitchen, the one that made cooking feel like something worth doing, on a Tuesday evening, looking at nothing in particular, and noticed something he hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. He felt fine. Not happy, exactly. Not the way the 23-year-old version of himself had imagined happy would feel when all the conditions were finally met. Just fine. Comfortable. Slightly restless. Already, in some part of his mind, he hadn't given permission to wander, composing a new list. That Tuesday evening, in a kitchen he had worked years to afford, is the thing we need to talk about today. Not because it's a tragedy. He was not suffering. But because it is one of the most honest and under-examined experiences of modern adult life. The experience of arriving somewhere you worked hard to reach and discovering that arrival feels almost nothing like you expected it to, and that the restlessness you thought would end when the conditions were finally right has simply found a new set of conditions to aim at. The Stoics called this, in various ways across 2,000 years of writing, the fundamental error of human desire, and they mapped it, its mechanism, its costs, and its cure, with a precision that no amount of modern self-help content has substantially improved upon. Let's start with the mechanism itself, because understanding it changes everything. There is a process, well documented now in psychology and neuroscience, that researchers call hedonic adaptation. The Stoics didn't have that term, but they understood the phenomenon with startling clarity. Here is how it works. The human mind has a remarkable capacity to return to a baseline state of satisfaction or dissatisfaction, regardless of what changes in external circumstances. A significant positive event, a promotion, a new relationship, a new purchase, a significant achievement, produces a genuine spike in positive feeling, and then, reliably, the feeling fades. Not because anything went wrong, not because you don't deserve to feel good about it, simply because the mind adjusts. The new circumstances become the new normal. The thing that was a source of joy when it was anticipated and when it first arrived has simply become part of the background of life, no more remarkable than the chair you always sit in. And then the restlessness returns, and the next thing presents itself. Seneca described this with the directness of someone who had watched it happen across an entire lifetime of wealth, influence, and achievement. He wrote about people who traveled endlessly, moving from city to city in the belief that a different location would produce the feeling of peace that had eluded them so far. And he wrote, with the sharpness of someone who had done exactly this himself, "You carry your trouble with you wherever you go. The source of your restlessness is not in the place, it is in you, and you take yourself with you on every journey." That is the mechanism in its plainest form. The restlessness is internal, the chasing is external, and no external destination, no salary, no apartment, no achievement, no person, no object, can address something that lives inside the person pursuing them. Here is what the Stoics understood about desire that makes their diagnosis so uncomfortably precise. The problem is not that we want things. The problem is the specific architecture of wanting, the structure it builds in the mind, and what that structure does to the experience of the present moment. Every time you locate your satisfaction in something you don't yet have, you do two things simultaneously. You create an imaginary version of the future in which the thing is possessed and the feeling is complete. And you create a devaluation of the present, because the present, by definition, does not contain the thing and therefore registers as insufficient, as a waiting room, as the period before the real part starts. This is so ordinary, so continuous, that most people barely notice it as a pattern. It is simply the texture of their inner life, perpetually oriented toward a future that, when it arrives, will immediately become the new present and therefore immediately become insufficient again. I'll be happy when I get the promotion, when I lose the weight, when I move to the new city, when the relationship settles, when the business takes off, when the children are older, when things are a little less busy, when I finally have enough. Enough. The word the Stoics would have circled, because enough is the destination that moves the moment you approach it. It is not a fixed point. It is a horizon line. The closer you get, the further it retreats, and a life spent chasing it spends almost all of itself in the condition of not yet, which is a condition so chronic and so invisible that people mistake it for personality. They call themselves driven, ambitious, motivated, not noticing that what they have actually built is a machinery of perpetual dissatisfaction, running on a fuel that never runs out, because desire, unlike the things it targets, is not finite. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in Rome. He had access to every material comfort the ancient world could produce. His position, his wealth, his influence were beyond what almost any other human being of his era could imagine. And he wrote, privately, about the danger of all of it, not because he was ungrateful, but because he understood, with the honesty of a man who examined himself relentlessly, what the wanting could do to a person who wasn't careful. He wrote about the things that people pursue with such urgency: fame, wealth, pleasure, power, and he named them consistently as things that were not worth what people typically paid for them in the currency of their own peace. Not because they were evil, not because wanting them was shameful, but because they were outside. And the Stoics had long understood that anything located outside the self is permanently outside the self's control, and that building your satisfaction on something you cannot control is building it on ground that will always eventually shift beneath you. He also wrote something that should stop any person who has felt the quiet deflation of a rival. Consider how many Caesars there have been, how many kings, how many generals, how many men who achieved everything they pursued and who are now entirely forgotten. What did their achievements preserve for them? What feeling outlasted the moment of its peak? He wasn't asking this to produce despair. He was asking it to produce proportion, the correct scale for the things we pursue. Not nothing, but not everything. Not the meaning of life, not the source of peace, not the arrival point of a self finally at rest. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave and had almost no material circumstances worth pursuing, understood something about desire that the wealthy man often cannot see because he is inside it. Desire, left unexamined, does not diminish when it is satisfied. It grows. This is the part of the mechanism that makes it genuinely dangerous. Every time you satisfy a desire, every time you get the thing, achieve the goal, acquire the object, the relief is real but brief. And what tends to follow is not contentment. It is an expansion of the appetite. Because the mind that has learned that wanting produces getting has reinforced the habit of wanting. And wanting, like any practiced habit, becomes easier and more reflexive over time. This is not weakness. It is simply how the human nervous system works. And the Stoics were among the first to name it clearly. The person who has everything and is still restless is not restless because they need more. They are restless because they have spent their entire life training themselves to be restless. They have practiced dissatisfaction so consistently, so skillfully, that contentment, even when the circumstances are objectively sufficient, has become genuinely difficult to access. It is a skill they never developed because they were always too busy chasing the next condition that was supposed to make it unnecessary. Seneca wrote one of the most devastating lines in all of ancient philosophy about this. It is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who craves more. He was not talking about money, he was talking about appetite. The poverty of the person who cannot be satisfied, who lives surrounded by abundance and feels scarcity, is more total in the Stoic view than any material poverty because it cannot be addressed by any material solution. There is nothing to give this person that will be enough, because enough is not a quantity. It is a condition of the mind. And the condition of the mind is the one thing the market cannot deliver. Here is the question worth asking, quietly and honestly. What were you actually looking for when you built the list? Not the salary, not the apartment, not the title or the recognition or the relationship. What feeling were you actually trying to produce? What was the thing you believed those items would deliver that made them worth pursuing? For most people, when they sit with this question honestly, the answer is some version of peace, of feeling like enough, of a quiet, steady sense that things are okay, that life is okay, that they are okay, that doesn't depend on the next thing going right. A feeling of being genuinely present in their own life rather than perpetually in transit through it. That feeling is what the 23-year-old with the list was actually after. The list was just the map he had been handed, the culturally available set of proxies for a feeling that none of them were actually capable of producing in any lasting way. The Stoics would say, you were looking in the right direction, but using the wrong instrument. The peace you were trying to buy with circumstances can only be built from the inside. Not because external things don't matter. The Stoics were not naive about the reality of material conditions, but because peace, as a sustained condition rather than a temporary spike, is a practice. It is something you construct through the daily discipline of attention, of honest self-examination, of choosing what to value and what to release. It cannot be achieved by acquiring the right set of external conditions, because the external conditions are always shifting, always temporary, always one bad quarter or one hard year away from changing into something you didn't want. The person who has built their peace on a foundation that can shift will spend their entire life managing the threat of that shift. The person who has built it on something internal, on values, on character, on the honest daily practice of being the kind of person they respect, has something the market cannot reprice and circumstance cannot revoke. The Stoic answer to perpetual dissatisfaction is not to stop wanting. That is neither possible nor particularly desirable. It is to cultivate deliberately and as a daily practice the experience of genuinely wanting what you already have. This is not positive thinking. It is not gratitude journaling in the way that phrase has come to mean something light and decorative. It is a serious, demanding practice that the Stoics called by various names, and that Marcus Aurelius practiced by regularly reminding himself in his private journal of the actual value of what was already present in his life. Not as a performance of gratitude, as a genuine reorientation of attention, away from what was absent and toward what was already there. Seneca described a related practice he called the premeditation of loss, the deliberate contemplation of what it would mean to lose what you currently have, not to produce anxiety, but to produce appreciation, to interrupt the mechanism of hedonic adaptation by actively remembering that the things which have become background noise, the health, the relationship, the work, the ordinary Tuesday in a kitchen with good light, are not permanent, are not guaranteed, are, if examined honestly, remarkable conditions that the younger version of you would have wanted very badly. He wrote, "Count your years and you will be ashamed at how little of your life you have actually experienced compared to how much of it you spent in anticipation of a future that, when it arrived, you were already past." There is a particular quality of attention that the Stoics were trying to train, a capacity for presence that does not require anything to be different from what it is in order to be valuable. Not perfect conditions, not the absence of difficulty, simply the honest recognition that this moment, this ordinary evening, this unremarkable conversation, this cup of something warm in the morning, is the life. Not the waiting room, the life. Because this is the honest part of the conversation. The desire doesn't stop. The Stoics weren't trying to produce people without appetite. They were trying to produce people whose appetite didn't control them. The distinction matters enormously. A person without desire is not at peace. They are simply depleted. But a person whose desire is examined, directed, and held at a proportion that doesn't consume everything around it, that person has something genuinely rare. The ability to pursue what matters without being destroyed by the things they don't yet have. Here's what that looks like in practice. It means becoming very deliberate about what you actually want, not what the culture is currently telling you to want, not what the algorithm has learned to put in front of you, not what the person next to you is pursuing and has thereby made visible as a possibility. What you, examined honestly, genuinely want. What your actual values, rather than your conditioned appetites, point toward. And it means building what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control directly into the structure of your desire. Pursuing the things that are genuinely within your control to produce, your effort, your character, the quality of your attention in work and relationships, and holding loosely, with real flexibility, the things that are outside it, the outcome, the recognition, the arrival at a specific external condition, not detachment from results, proportion about them, the understanding that the result is not the point, the person you become in the pursuing of it, the discipline built, the character refined, the way of seeing the world that develops through sustained, honest engagement with something that matters. That is the point, and it is something no external outcome can give you, and no external failure can take away. He made another list, eventually. Not at 23, at 31, sitting in that kitchen on that unremarkable Tuesday evening. It was shorter than the first one, and different in a way that took him a while to articulate. The first list had been a list of things to acquire. The second list was a list of things to become. The kind of attention he wanted to bring to his work, the quality of presence he wanted in his closest relationships, the honesty he wanted to practice when honesty cost him something, the way he wanted to meet difficulty, not avoiding it, but not being consumed by it either. None of those things were acquirable. None of them came with an arrival moment, a clear before and after, a feeling that the condition had been met and could now be crossed off. They were practices, daily, imperfect, never quite finished practices. And they produced something the first list never had. Not the feeling of having arrived, but the feeling of being genuinely inside his own life while he was living it. Present rather than in transit. Here rather than perpetually en route to somewhere else. That is the Stoic offering. Not the end of desire, not the death of ambition, not a life of joyless contentment with whatever happens to show up, but the reorientation of what you are chasing, away from conditions you cannot permanently secure, toward the one thing that actually holds, the quality of who you are, in the ordinary moments, when nothing remarkable is happening and nobody is watching. That is what the 23-year-old was looking for when he made his list. He just didn't know yet that it couldn't be put on one. The restlessness you feel right now, if you feel it, is not evidence that something is wrong with your life. It is not a signal that you need a better plan or a bigger goal or a more impressive set of circumstances. It is a signal about the direction of your attention, about where you have placed the conditions for your own peace. The Stoics would ask you one question, and mean it seriously. What would it mean to want this, exactly this, your actual life as it currently exists, genuinely, without performing gratitude and without pretending the hard parts aren't hard? Not forever, not as a surrender, just for right now, for this moment, for the length of time it takes to actually inhabit your life instead of passing through it on the way to the next version. That is the practice. It is harder than acquiring things. It is less visible than achievement. It produces nothing you can post or display or point to as evidence of your progress. And it is the only thing in 2,000 years of Stoic examination that has been found to actually work. If this landed somewhere real for you, if it named the restlessness you've been living inside without quite having words for it, bring it into the comments. I want to know what your list looks like and what you're starting to question about it. Share this with someone who just got what they wanted and is quietly wondering why it doesn't feel the way they expected. Not to diminish what they achieved, to give them the question that might finally redirect them somewhere that holds. Subscribe to Modern Stoicism. We go here every single week. And until next time, stop for a moment. Look at what's already here. The life you were chasing might already be the one you're living.